And I understand, listeners, it's a little bit disappointing when we get to Monday morning, reviewing one of the big games of the weekend, and it turns out to be a 0-0 draw. But look, there was plenty of narrative involved anyway in the Clásico, in Porto 0, Benfica 0, which put an end to Porto's 100% record at the start of this season. But Miguel, it did feel at the end of this, even if we obviously naturally assume that José Mourinho will be delighted with this 0-0 draw away from home, and both coaches actually seemed pretty happy at the end, and it felt like it suited everyone.
Yeah, I think both are extremely happy for different reasons, of course. I think Mourinho is the happiest of the two. I think he went for the draw and he played for the draw and he got exactly the result he wanted. I think he didn't trust his team to be any different than what they did on the pitch. So probably to get out of Porto with the same 4 point distance for him is key. And I think for Farioli, he understood the difficulty of playing a Mourinho side. I think he was a little bit starstruck about Mourinho. Let's face it, Farioli was a teenager when Mourinho arrived in Italy at the first time. So probably in somehow it influenced him. And at the same time, I think in at least in the final half an hour, he was a little bit more of an Italian manager that he has been so far. And he just was happy for the draw and he played the long game. He even said so in the press conference in the end. He didn't want to do an all-in because there's still a lot of months of competition ahead. And I think in the end, both managers were happy. I don't think supporters were, especially from Porto, but it was a very different affair of the last Clásicos that we saw, with Benfica winning 4-1 last year and Porto winning 5-0 2 years ago. So it was a rather downgrade in terms of goals and spectacle, but it was also a very interesting tactical affair.
Well, we'll come to the Farioli side of it in a minute, because I think the way that he approached it and the way he talked about how he approached it afterwards was fascinating. In fact, you could argue that the interviews that the coaches did after the match were more interesting than the match itself. But look, we'll come to that in a second. I think a lot of people will want to know about Jose Mourinho and how he's doing at Benfica. Look, he's inherited a lot of problems, as I think we might have touched on the pod already. He's taking over a team just a few matches into the season, just a few months into the season, who's played a lot of matches already. If you look at the teams that were in the last 16 of the Club World Cup, Benfica have played more than the ones that you assume have played the most, so Chelsea, PSG, but by quite a long way. And in that early part of the season, both in the last few games of Bruno Lage and in the first few games of Mourinho, Benfica have looked so tired. They've looked really, really leggy, which is a bad sign, obviously, at this stage during the season. It's difficult to see how Mourinho can really cure that. In that sense, is his get people behind the ball and don't necessarily make the game kind of philosophy a little bit more acceptable with where Benfica are physically and resource-wise at the moment?
Yeah, and I think also emotionally, I think the greatest danger that Benfica faces right now is a mental lockdown, and I think Mourinho is quite aware of that. I think if the club enters a spiral when they ended up being defeated by title contenders, or keep losing games in the Champions League, that could have consequences throughout the season. So I think he played it safe, like he tried to play it safe with Chelsea, in a sense that he knows the team doesn't have his principles yet, at least the basic tactical principles that he wants to implement. He knows he has very talented individual players, but that still don't work as a collective, as a team. And he still has to figure it out, the right pieces for the right tactical positions that he wants to try it in. Yesterday, he moved for a more classic 4-4-2, for instance, because he really wanted more to cover the way that Porto play than to proactively play. And I think he's playing the safe game for the month. And also there's elections on Benfica, and this is a really big deal in Lisbon. Benfica is a very bipolar football club, very intense, as it should be being, from the Iberian Peninsula. And I think probably the squad is very affected by it, because there's a real possibility that the current chairman, Rui Costa, wouldn't get re-elected. And that means a lot of changes in the future. And I think players are not immune to that. Certainly the staff isn't. So he has to deal with all those situations. And regarding that, the park the bus thing that he made so popular a few years back makes more sense than if he was a different Benfica, if it was at a different part of the season, this match.
Mourinho said afterwards, his words were, "We wanted to win, but we couldn't lose." So in terms of staying in the race, it was clear that playing this way was not just acceptable, but imperative, I suppose. I mean, so much was made, of course, in England of the emotional return to Chelsea. But in this same week, we talked about the emotions for the players. There's a lot, presumably, for Jose Mourinho, because he's going back to Porto, where he did such incredible work, where he made his reputation as a top level coach, with Benfica, to take on a game where he's facing a guy who used to work with him, and not just a guy who used to work for him in André Villas-Boas, but now a guy who runs and sets the whole sporting politic of FC Porto as the president. I guess there must have been much more chat in Portugal about the fact that he's facing this guy who used to be his apprentice, and really his quite bold transfer policy, André Villas-Boas, has been behind Porto's really exciting start to the season.
When people ask, oh, how do you think about Villas-Boas because you work with him? And Mourinho said, no, you work under me, which is different. So I think that Mourinho ego is still there. And he's a guy that I don't think he was ever very emotionally attached to Porto, at least throughout his career. He really never mentioned the exploits with Porto at the same level as the one he did for Inter, for instance. I think he connected more with Inter than with Porto, probably because as a kid he was a Benfica supporter, as everyone knows, in Portugal. So that has something to do with it. Probably because Porto is not as important internationally, so he needs to grab up to be more connected with high-profile clubs like Inter or Chelsea in the case of the Premier League. But in the end, I think what he knows is what Porto is all about. And he knew that if Porto ended up winning that match, keep that 100% streak winning, it would be very, very hard to catch them up in the end of the season. So he was just doing damage contention there. He was just trying to stop the euphoria created around this team of Porto, a club that has not been able not to win the league over the past 2 years, but to fight for the league title, which is even worse for a club that has won so much over the past 40 years. And he knew that he had to do something to release a little bit of the expectations generated about the Villas-Boas project, who is working very well at all levels until now. And he wanted to be the guy that Sporting couldn't do in the match. That he wanted to be the guy stopping them, because with Sporting drawing with Braga just a few minutes before the match kicked off, if Porto had come out winners that night, it would be very hard to see another title contender able to challenge them at least over the next few months. And Porto would be on a cruise to probably win the league. And I think Mourinho thought about that more than the match itself, the possibilities of getting out of the title race just 4 weeks into the job, basically.
Yeah, that's it, isn't it? But as you said, when we look at the game itself, Farioli was a little bit circumspect, it's fair to say. And Rodrigo Mora, for example, the player who you think could really open up this game. So for those who are unaware of him, 18-year-old who's come through the Porto Academy, came quite close to leaving for Saudi Arabia this summer, but someone who has stayed and someone who is massively important to the Porto fans. And Farioli brings him on in stoppage time. And you're thinking, okay, what's the point in this? What is even the point of this? And he nearly wins the game. He hits the crossbar in the second minute of stoppage time in what would have been, I guess, regarded as an absolute tactical masterstroke. Was there an argument for getting Rodrigo Mora on before? And I guess explain to us and explain to people who aren't familiar with him exactly who Rodrigo Mora is and what he means for Porto and Portuguese football, I guess, more broadly in the future.
I think Mora probably right now is the biggest youth prospect in Portuguese football for quite a while. And he has the traits of being a very commanding figure over the next 15 years due to his young age. He's also a maverick. He's also one of those players that make things happen. And probably a lot of managers don't like that profile, especially because it means losing some balls, especially means they don't have the same tactical discipline. And I think Farioli is one of those guys. I think he prefers a more center type of creative midfielder in Gabriel Veiga, who is more of a Spanish midfielder, knows how to keep a ball, knows how to keep the ball running, while Mora is a midfielder with the soul of a striker. He really wants to push forward all the time. He's really wanting to score goals at every single position he's in. He always tries to find where the ball is and then where the goal is instead of where is his teammate. He's also able to do brilliant passing, but is a striker playing in a midfield position. And I think Farioli wants a midfielder with a soul of a midfielder there. That's why he prefers Vega. And Moura is a youth grown, which is very important to the local culture of the club, especially to Villas-Boas. He made a promise in the campaign that he would again make Porto a club very focused on the academy, something that had been lost during the Conceição years because he preferred more veteran players who had been hardened in battle for seasons. And he's trying to find his place in his project. He was the best player the previous season. Of course, the previous season was total catastrophe. So he was the only good news that Porto had in the previous season, and supporters really took a like to him. So it's been hard for Farioli to manage the situation because despite all the record winnings, the inability to have been able to find a place for him, the starting 11 is the only thing probably that supporters of Porto now point the finger at him. And I think what happened is in the moment that he decides to take Vega off, because he was already extremely tired from fighting for each ball, the decision to put in Pablo Rosario, who is a guy that he knows so well from his days at Nice. He's a soldier of Farioli. He's a player that is going to behave like he wants to, instead of putting more a center message. And I think Mourinho understood the message there. I think it was like a white flag that he waved in saying that we're just 25 minutes into the end of the game. Let's not kill each other here. Let's just be happy for the draw. And then when he releases Moura, I think it's more because PP just got a yellow card and is more afraid that it could be a red card because the situation is being more tense over the final minutes, and he had another substitution to spend. So I think he used it more as a joker card. Let's see what happens here. And like you said before, it could have happened for him, and he would probably be reminded as a genius for putting him at the game when everyone was tired and he was fresh and full of wanting to decide the game for his club, and it almost happened. But I think it will be the greatest issue with Farioli over the next few months, how he gets to put Moura into play more often for Porto. Because, of course, he played in the first lineup against Sporting in Lisbon because Vega was injured, and he played brilliantly. Porto won that match, and Moura did a very excellent job. Of course, also they had Luke de Jong that match, and yesterday they played with Samo, and it's a very different kind of striker, Luke de Jong from Samo, and the team plays very differently when one is on the pitch, regardless of the other. So I think Porto yesterday, if they had de Jong available, it would have been a very different match because there was a lot of on possession balls that Samo isn't able to release it to the right player at the right time. And sometimes Porto's counter were hurt for that. And probably that's one of the reasons that he understood that he had to play for the draw in the final minutes.
I mean, this was a philosophical question, wasn't it, when Sergio Conceição was coach? I mean, looking from the outside, a lot of people look at Conceição's job with Porto and think, Porto legend, didn't he do a great job? He won a lot with not an incredible amount of resource. Of course, they were still under quite heavy FFP manners at the time from the UEFA settlement, and he managed to win trophies and make them competitive in the Champions League. But some Porto regulars, some fans looked at it and thought, well, if you look at all the great teams that FCP have had down the years, Conceição hasn't really sort of matched any of those. Now, obviously, part of that is resource, but there was always the suspicion that Conceição preferred physically rigorous players to inspirational ones, ones that would really mark the history of the club. Do you sense this could be a bit of a, I don't know if it's too dramatic to say battle for the soul of FC Porto, but certainly in terms of what the team should mean and what the club should mean? Do you sense this being a bit of a debate while Farioli's coach as well?
Yeah, I think Farioli, he came with a very particular idea that usually works well in Portugal with foreign managers. If they bring pace, if they bring intensity on pressing high, they usually pick up their opponents unprotected. Portugal is a football league, as you know well, that is played with a different tempo from European continental leagues. So when you come with a more resolutive attacking mindset when on the ball, and you know how to defend yourself well, you're touted to be a winner. It happened with Benfica, with Roger Schmidt, for instance, a few years ago. You just press forward and usually works out. And I think the way Farioli came in was he detected that if he had players like Froholt, for instance, who can run forever, or Borja Sainz, who is very good on high pressing. Those sorts of players decide matches on their favor against most of the opposition. Is not as pretty as other teams from Porto, but it's quite effective. And at the same time, is more offensive-minded than the times of Conceição, when he actually played on the counter for most of the matches, even when he was playing with sides that were much inferior to Porto in budget or in reputation. And I think at least Fariola changed a little bit the profile, because he had now assumed that Porto needs to be the favourite at every single match at home. He has been playing accordingly, even with matches away. But at the same time, I think his style of play depends a lot of intensity. It's not about controlling the ball in an artistic, creative mindset, as was Villas-Boas back in the day he was coach. Of course, he doesn't have the same players that Villas-Boas had. If you remember that team, you had James Rodriguez, you had Falcao, you had Hulk, you had João Moutinho, so you had some of the best players in Europe at the time. Farioli has some interesting players that could have great careers in the future, but they're not quite at that level yet. But I think his key will be if he can maintain that intensity throughout the season. And that's one of the fears that most Porto supporters had, because they know what happened last year at Amsterdam. He knows that when batteries run out, the team didn't have the tactical idea to keep the ball, to keep commanding the games from possession. And I think yesterday he suffered a little bit, because when Benfica just delivered the ball to Porto, there were a lack of ideas. There were lack of movements in the offense to just disrupt the Benfica defense. And I think Porto will be suffering from more opponents who play like Benfica. But in the Portuguese league, not many teams play like Benfica, or at least they're not as afraid as they were of Benfica. And Farioli recognized that as much, because they knew that on the counter, Benfica could be really dangerous, something they don't think other opponents will be. So the curious thing is to see more than within the league how we will fare in the UEFA Europa League, because that is where we will find rivals who are as intense as him, and will probably have different arguments to play on the counter. That will measure his true worth. For the time being, he's 100% not losing a single match until now. All defeats, all wins except the draw from yesterday, has been enough to convince the supporter that he's an upgrade from Conceição, but he still has a long way ahead of him.
Yeah, and of course he's been celebrated in the fact there's this Dutch-Italian rap song that's been released, Mr. Farioli, which I think one of the players was playing out of a speaker when they were in the airport to go to Salzburg for the Europa League a couple of weeks ago. I think he enjoyed that. But if we're talking about figures who could be big and could be really celebrated at Porto going forward, it already happened with him as a coach, André Villas-Boas, now the president. Now, he is sort of, I suppose in a way, some would argue he's like the Keir Starmer of FC Porto, someone who came in and it was impossible for him to look good straight away because of the problems that he inherited. It was a really tough first season. He maybe made a bad first choice as coach. Vitor Bruno didn't last very long, who had been previously the assistant to Sergio Conceição. So I guess Farioli is a big appointment for him, and he has gone out there and, as we said, been very busy in the transfer market. How big is this season for André Villas-Boas?
If it wasn't yesterday a big all-in match for Farioli, it definitely is an all-in season for Villas-Boas. And supporters really backed him, and to be able to beat someone as important as Pinto Costa was for the history of the club shows massive responsibility from his side. And at the same time, supporters understood that he couldn't provide any miracles in the first season, although they never understood the two choices he made for coach. Probably chose Vitor Bruno was Conceição's assistant, because he didn't have any other option on the table. Most of people believe he couldn't win. He himself thought he wasn't winning the election, so probably that's why he didn't have any coach hire before, or at least he didn't have anyone already inside of the project. And then it was the financial situation Porto was in. They weren't able to pay a salary high enough to persuade important managers to leave what they were doing and sign for Porto at the time. So I think he believed that having someone that already knew the players, already knew the club, would be good to a species of a mid-season where he would start to make the drastic changes he had to do in terms of regulating the finance department, and try to bring Porto back into the future after so many years where the club had been delayed by the late Pinto da Costa era. And he was aware that it would be hard to compare sporting wise. But I think his greatest mistake was not Vitor Bruno, but Martin Anselmi. That was a mistake in a sense that the way that he thought the game, the way that he decided to play, really didn't match with Porto's squad, didn't really match with Porto's identity. So that was a little bit of a sense of 6 months lost into the future. But then Farioli, I think he really fits in with the idea of the 4-3-3 that has been used for the club for so long, with the high pressing tempo. And for him, most important, just finding the right manager was to find the right players. And although he's already left the club, Zubizarreta was key, bringing in the Spaniards from Gabri Veiga and Borja Sainz, who have been fundamental to Farioli's idea. But I really do believe that the key signings this season had been in defence. Bringing in Alberto Costa was a really upgrade from João Mario from Juventus, has been outstanding during the season so far. Bringing in both Bednarek and Kyrgios sent a message that Porto was able to bring in guys that were Premier League players. That was a message to the market as well. And of course, Vitor Froholt, who has been probably the most decisive player of the season so far in Portugal.
Yeah, brilliant.
He's a gem. And probably he'll have a lot of teams from the Premier League already pointing his name out for next summer, because he has proven himself to be an insatiable running machine, but also has a lot of criteria on the ball, still has a way ahead of him. But the way that he brought balance to the midfield, something that was lacking with players that were more slow on the ball, like Eustáquio, who played alongside Varela, really brought a new physical and tactical dimension to the side that they didn't have last season. And that upgrade probably made all the pieces stick into Farioli's idea. That's why Porto's beginning of the season has been so strong.
You talked about the appointment of Martin Anselmi, who was originally sold as the Argentinian Ruben Amorim, in a positive sense, by the way, Manchester United fans, not a negative sense, when he arrived at the club. And it didn't work out at all, as you said. I mean, if we look back at the Club World Cup and how this could affect Porto and Benfica going forward, it feels like it's something that's still hanging over Benfica because, of course, they look really tired, as we've said. I wonder if, in another sense, the Club World Cup experience, which on the pitch didn't go nearly as well for Porto, they were poor in their games and they went out the first round. If the Club World Cup has sort of worked for them in a way, because if they hadn't have had the Club World Cup, they probably would have started this season with Anselmi as coach. But the fact that it went badly, I mean, on one hand, they had the marketing opportunity and all that sort of other stuff that, you know, these elite or aspiring to be elite European clubs absolutely love. And on the other hand, they played badly enough on the pitch that they had an excuse to get rid of Anselmi, clean house and start all over again. So actually, the Club World Cup thing, even if it's sticking with Benfica in a sort of negative way and they're kind of paying the price for it now, for Porto, it actually worked out quite well, didn't it?
It was a sliding door moment, I think. I think Villas-Boas was aware back in April when Porto lost against Benfica at home that he had to sack Anselmi, but he also had to keep face. He had just hired the man 3 months ago. Sacking a second manager on his first year was a very hard thing to justify to supporters. Gives you the idea that I don't know what I'm doing. And it's this first season as chairman of a football club, never had any previous experience. So he really wanted a justification to be able to move in to the next stage. And Anselmi provided that with the team play so poorly. And at the same time, I think it also helped to sparkle for the few players that remain on the squad. Because if you look at the Porto squad that played on the World Cup, so few players are now in the usual choices of Farioli. You have, of course, Rui Costa in goal. Then you have Moraes left back. But then again, only Varela and Veiga and eventually PP, who already said that it was a clean slate for him after the World Cup, were only present at that starting 11. Every other player who was playing for under Farioli is new to the team, was hired after the Club World Cup. So I think the players that came after weren't affected by the tournament, and the players who actually played it were so hurt on their egos or so hurt on the experience they had lived in the previous season that they really wanted to show themselves, really wanted to show they were better than that. And probably that raised a sense of, we need to do well this season because we hit the ground in the 24-25 season. Now we need to get ourselves up and prove that we are better than people think we are. And I think all the players that went there and are playing under Farioli now are really doing their best to change the image that they had left last season, especially PP. I think PP is doing an excellent job under Farioli. Was a very important player under Conceição over the last couple of seasons, often playing as right back or winger. Last year he was completely lost, both under Bruno and Anselmi, and is rediscover himself now this season. He also has competition in William, which is a good thing because some of the players work better when they have someone who is pressing their heels. And Porto this year has and William has in more a joker that can decide games coming from the bench, also very young, a lot of potential into the future. So I think the World Cup was ground zero for Villas-Boas' first year of project, and also gave him the right motivation to say, no, I have to do things differently. I have to go all in the market. I have to go all in with the choice of the manager, and the players assume that position as well.
So, if we look at the Benfica side of it, and how Mourinho might be looking at this going forward, the other side of the international break, I mean, this week has kind of worked well for him because they've gone away, got given two pretty gritty performances at Chelsea and Porto, which, as we said, have clearly held some sort of narrative meaning for him as well. But they're kind of two quite useful big games, first two big games to have for Mourinho, because he's not expected to make the play. He can come away from both of those and say, we competed and we did as well as can be expected at this stage. And particularly with the Classico result, there's tangible reward because Porto is still relatively within striking distance. But where does he go forward from here? Now, I think if we're looking at the previous game, so say we look at the game against Gil Vicente, for example, the game before they played Chelsea, which they won, but they had less shots, they had less possession. And you can say Gil Vicente have started this season brilliantly, and they have, of course, top four after this weekend's results. For Benfica, there's no talking your way around that, is there, with the resources that they've got? So I guess philosophically, particularly if Rui Costa loses the presidency, and of course both Rui Costa and Mourinho himself have been defending his appointment, and Rui Costa said he's not earning any more than Roger Schmidt earned before, and Mourinho said, and this is factually correct, of course, that he would have been earning more picking up his sitting on the sofa and picking up his Fenerbahce salary, which is fine. It's good to know that Mourinho is still motivated by the challenge, and he's got a big ego. He's definitely risking something by coming back to Benfica. But is the gamble that Mourinho has taken a gamble he can win? I mean, not just in the context of this game, but in the context of what we're going to see over the next couple of months. Basically, is it possible for Benfica to win the title?
It's possible, of course. I think in the Portuguese league, when you have a squad as talented as Benfica has, where you are obliged to win every single match except the ones you play against Porto and Sporting, then you are in a title race. And Benfica now, with the points disadvantage they have for Porto still having to play Sporting, they are really much into the title race. And I think Mourinho knew that these first 3 weeks in charge, the purpose of being until the stoppage of the international matches was to keep Benfica in the title race, whatever the cost. It was the most important thing that he had to look for, more than implementing his style of play, more than playing attractively to supporters. He just needed to get the results, and I think he did, because coming out with 1 point from Porto, and also with the possibility of they get a better result playing at Toulouse late in February to get the end-to-end result in their favour, which sometimes in Portugal can be decisive because it's the first tie break if teams are squared in points at the end of the season.
Ahead of goal difference.
Yeah, exactly. As ahead of goal difference. So, but at the same time, I don't think it's too much of a gamble for Mourinho, because Mourinho knows what he's going to do after the summer. I think everyone in Portugal is quite aware that he's going to be the national manager from next year onward. I think the contract he signed with Benfica already includes a clause that was sold out as being a clause for the next Benfica chairman, if it's not Rui Costa, that they can terminate the contract on mutual agreement at the end of the season. But it goes both ways. Mourinho can do that as well. And the thing is, I think Mourinho was already expecting to be the Portugal national manager in this World Cup if things hadn't gone so well for Roberto Martinez in the League of Nations. But since they did, and the Portuguese Federation with the new chairman, which is Pedro Proença, who doesn't go eye to eye with Martinez, he inherited Martinez from the previous board. He really wants to bring Mourinho in to create a winning project for the 2030 World Cup, which Portugal was going to host alongside Spain and Morocco. So Mourinho wants to be there as well. His ego needs to be there. He needs to be the national coach in 2030. So I think his original plan for the season was to stay in Turkey until June, whatever the results, and then just move to Portugal. And that sacking came as a surprise probably to him as well. And he saw an opportunity to be still on the move, working for Benfica, also coming back to Portugal and to plant his base here in Portugal, as he wants to be in the next 4 years at least until the 2030 World Cup. So I think he knows that he wants to win the league. Of course, his ego needs to be reassured that he still is able to win leagues. He hasn't won a football league since he won one with Chelsea 10 years ago. So that's a long time for a manager like Mourinho. But at the same time, I think he knows what's going to happen to him into the future. And if things don't go his way, he just needs to put on a good face. He just needs to have the team fight until the end. And then he can say, well, I inherited a team. It wasn't me from the day one. So I did my best. And probably Porto was just too strong for us because they had 2 months work in advance over me. So that made a difference. And thank you very much for having me. And we'll see you in the future. And I think he's much more relaxed because of that. Yeah.
Is there a danger to his reputation, though, Miguel? Because everywhere else, we look at where he's sort of torched his reputation. Even at Roma, where he got to 2 European finals, it didn't end well. It didn't go well at Fenerbahce because whatever excuses he wants to make, he was given a squad that should be really winning the Turkish Super League, and they didn't come close in the end, and that they couldn't qualify for the Champions League in either of those 2 seasons, even though he sat there going, oh, well, Fenerbahce is not really a Champions League club, is it? Well, it should be with a wage bill like that. I mean, it would be easy for him to put his feet up in Saudi Arabia, earn loads more. And I guess that will always be his argument, wouldn't it? I'm a genuine lover of football because I've come back and put my reputation on the line. Is there a little bit of a risk there? Because if you look at, say, Cristiano Ronaldo, for example, who is the other big name of Portuguese football, or, A++ name of Portuguese football in the last 20 years, he's chosen to go out to Saudi Arabia and have a nice, it looks good end to his career. Whereas, he could have come back to Sporting and done his little lap of honour, and he's not. Whereas Mourinho, he's driven by something else, isn't he? I mean, it is a risk in a sense, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a risk. And he's a guy that has shown through times that he likes to prove himself. And to be able to, I think this will be his last club work. I think his career now is going to move to the international football, with Portugal most likely, and then again after the 2030 World Cup, who knows. But I think he wants to have his last work as a football manager of a football club to be a success story, to be the closing end, and coming back where he started. It kind of brings a sort of mythology into it, because we can picture people talking about Mourinho, say he started his career in 2000 in Benfica, didn't work out for him there. Then again, he began a brilliant career in Porto, and it just came back to Benfica to close that chapter before he moves to the national side. So for him, for the way that he likes to project his image, to project his role in the football history, it will be massive if he finished the season winning a league title for Benfica, biggest club in Portugal, the club that he supposedly supports since he was a kid, a club where all things started 25 years ago. So it is a risk. But at the same time, since the Portuguese league is what it is, and he already knows what he's going to do next, is a calculated risk. Because, regardless of what happens with Benfica this season, the Portuguese job will still be his. It doesn't depend on what he does this season to be able to manage Portugal into the future or not. So it is a calculated risk, but it's a risk nonetheless.
There we go. Well, we'll watch that with great interest as the season unfolds and the second Clásico to come. And of course, as Miguel says, Porto have still got to play Sporting as well back at Dragão. So that's going to be really, really fascinating. Plenty of juice in that race. We'll get Miguel back on to talk about that again. So thanks for joining us, Miguel.